All right, so tonight we are in our 14th installment of this series, and we're looking at Jose Raul Capablanca, who has something of a mystic status among chess players. He's revered and highly looked up to, even in the current generation of players. And we're going to see some of what his contemporaries thought of him and what some modern experts think of him today. But before we do that, we'll start as we usually do by saying that I'm Lucas Anderson. I do a lot of research and read a lot of books for this, which makes me quite happy. And Warren gets to look at a lot of good chess games, which makes him happy, and we're both happy to be here presenting tonight. So Jose Capablanca was born in Cuba in 1888 in Havana and died, as you can see, March 8th in New York City, and he is buried in Havana, Cuba. He was known by many things during his life. He was called Capa, quite simply, Maestro, most famously by the King of Belgium. He was called the Cuban Morphy, which is pretty interesting, and I wanted to talk about that a bit because many people thought that Capablanca was actually Morphy reincarnated. This belief came not only from people alive at the time of when Capablanca lived. Capablanca wasn't entirely sure himself, but he took a trip to Louisiana and he met some people who knew Paul Morphy, and they pointed out to him that he did not look like Paul Morphy, and that seemed to be good enough for him. But his second wife, even until the 1980s, when she was talking to Edward Winter and Gennady Sasanko, she would ask them, do you believe in reincarnation? Because it was her belief that her husband may in fact have been a reincarnated version of Paul Morphy. Now, I can't speak authoritatively on that one way or the other, but I found that anecdote quite interesting. So Capablanca was born to a father, Jose Maria Capablanca, and a mother, Maria Marin, and it is very difficult to find information on his father and mother. Most of the time we simply talk about Capablanca, and incidentally Capablanca often referred to himself in the third person by calling himself Capablanca, so I'm going to call him Capablanca tonight. It's hard to find information on his parents, but we do know that his father was lieutenant in the Spanish army. Now, Cuba, at the time that Capablanca was born, was a territory of Spain, and so Capablanca's family essentially were all of Spanish descent, and his father was, as I mentioned, an officer in the Spanish army, garrisoned obviously in Havana. He came from a big family. He had 10 brothers and sisters, some older, some younger. He was kind of in the middle. And he did have a son and daughter with his first wife, and you can see their dates there. I couldn't actually find conclusively whether his daughter is still alive or not. If anybody knows, I'd certainly appreciate that information. But he did have a son with his first wife, and that son passed away a significant amount of time ago. All right, so before we get into Capablanca the child, we need to talk a little bit about the context, because this was a very turbulent time in the history of Spain for a number of reasons. First, there had been many different wars, some short, some fairly long, to try for Cuba to gain its independence from Spain. Primarily, those were fought and organized by native Cubans, in most notably Jose Marti, who is a national hero of Cuba to this day. But it was a time where the United States was looking like an expansionist nation. They looked like they were going to try to seize territories outside of the United States, notably Hawaii. There was talk about making Hawaii a state. Of course, it became a state much, much later, but this was when the United States gained possession of the island. There was talk of the United States extending its reach to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, which we do claim as a territory to this day, to the Philippines, which we do not. And so the United States was invested fairly heavily in the Cuban economy. And the Cuban economy was actually very significant at the time. Through agriculture and through its and through manufacturing, Cuba was the second most powerful economy in the Western Hemisphere in 1900 after the United States. We don't really think about that today because Cuba is not the second most powerful economy in the Western Hemisphere to date. But at the time it was. It was a very cultured, well-developed country. And the United States certainly did feel that it would make for a great territory to possess. The U.S. Secretary of State in the late 19th century famously said that it was the key to the Gulf of Mexico. And so there was this belief that the United States was coming for Cuba. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the USS Maine, but here's an interesting picture with the USS Maine entering the harbor at Havana. To the right of that picture is Morro Castle. That will come up again later, so I just wanted to point that out. In 1896, Cuba went to war. It was the War for Cuban Independence, or the Cuban War of Independence, excuse me, and it was 1895 to 1898. And it was led by Jose Marti, who had been exiled from Cuba and had gone to Florida, not Miami, to Tampa. And he organized a revolutionary Cuban party, El Partido Revolucionario Cubano. And he planned to come back to the United States with Cuban nationals who had been exiled like him and with lots and lots of weapons, which the Spanish government had forbade individuals to own, and mount an insurrection. And so he landed in Cuba in 1895. Incidentally, he died not long after that in a battle, but the fight was carried on his behalf. It escalated. It was aggravated by many factors, notably yellow journalism. You may remember from high school history the story of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, two newspaper moguls who engaged in yellow journalism. Essentially, they engaged in propaganda to hype the plight of the Cubans. And this put a lot of pressure on the United States government to act, which the United States government resisted until 1898, more specifically February 15th, 1898, when the USS Maine blew up. Now, the USS Maine was anchored in the harbor in Havana. The reason that it blew up is still under debate to this day, but at the time it was portrayed, as you can see from this newspaper article, that it was the work of the Spanish forces, more particularly a mine placed by the Spanish Navy that blew up the ship and cost 258 Americans their lives. However, we think to this day, at least there's a significant percentage of experts who believe that the USS Maine was actually an accident, that it blew up because it used a form of coal, bituminous coal, which was prone to explosion. It was prone to a buildup of gases, which would result in an explosion if exposed to any sort of accelerant or any sort of spark, and they think, and many people believe this is what happened. But that's not the way it was portrayed in the media. The media immediately jumped on it, said it was the work of Spain, and that the United States had to go to war to defend its interests. And reluctantly, the president agreed, and Congress declared war on Spain. And in 1898, the United States entered a war, the Cuban War for Independence. The United States involvement lasted for about 10 weeks. That's all it took to severely cripple Spain's navy, both in the Atlantic near Cuba and in the Pacific near the Philippines. And this also turned into the Filipino War for Independence as well. But as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States was awarded temporary custody or control, if you will, over Cuba. Now, I don't know exactly what happened with Capablanca's father. Obviously, he lived through this, but he was an officer for the Spanish army, and they were defending against an insurrection not only from Cuba, but also the involvement of the United States. And remember that Morro Castle there on the harbor at Havana? Well, that's where Capablanca's father, Jose, was garrisoned. So he was certainly witness to a lot of the history. In fact, that picture I showed with the USS Maine chugging into harbor, maybe one of those kids swimming was our young Capablanca. Who knows? But the point is, Capablanca was a witness to very interesting history going on in his own country in a very turbulent time. And it does explain his chess development to some extent. Now, Capablanca was a very, very bright 4-year-old. His father, garrisoned at Morro Castle, as the story goes, was playing against a fellow soldier, and Capablanca went and watched one of their games. Watched the first game, watched the second game, and after the second game was adjourned, he told his father that he had made a mistake, and the father was very doubtful of this, so Capablanca did what any 4-year-old would do probably, and he challenged his dad right there and then to a game, which he won, having never played chess before and having only seen it twice. And he was drawn to chess more than anything out of boredom. There wasn't much for him to do, not much to keep his attention, and chess did. And so at 4 years old, he started playing. And he needed a pretty tall high chair to do it. It was very cute, though. His parents were somewhat concerned about him playing chess, and they went to see a prominent neurologist at the time who advised that young Capablanca refrain from playing chess. So his parents actually forbade him from playing chess for quite a while. Now, this sounds similar to Morphy, right? Morphy was watching his dad and uncle play on the back porch and saw how his dad could have won instead of accepting a draw, and intervened and said, here's the winning combination, and how his parents didn't want him to play chess and only allowed him to play chess in very limited contexts. Well, Capablanca went through much the same thing. But I should also mention that Capa was a very, very bright 4-year-old in other ways. The story goes that Capablanca could read 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages of a history textbook once or twice and repeat it verbatim. So he may very well have had a photographic memory, and this isn't the first time we've encountered it. Many of the people we've talked about, have had prodigious memories. Capablanca was no exception. Now, Capablanca was fortunate that Havana was actually a pretty busy center for chess. You may know that in 1889, Havana hosted the World Championship match between Steinitz and Chigorin, which Steinitz won. Now, Capablanca was maybe a year or two old at the time. Obviously, he had no knowledge of this, but this led to quite a bit of interest in chess, which may have explained why his father was playing, which may have explained, how Capablanca learned and got interested in chess. We've certainly ran into that situation with many other world champions that we've looked at. And so Havana had a pretty active chess club, and young Capablanca would go and watch. Sometimes he would play against the prominent players of his day and the masters. And notably, in 1901, Capablanca is 12 or 13 years old. He plays against Juan Corzo, who is the champion of Cuba at the time, in a match, and beats him. I think the score was something like 4 wins, 3 losses, and 3 draws, or something like that. So it was close, but Capablanca at 13 was arguably the best chess player in Cuba. Well, there's not much left for him in Cuba in terms of competition. So with his family's agreement, he goes to the United States. Now, he went primarily to the United States for educational reasons. Now, again, the United States and Cuba are very, very close, and going from one to the other is no big deal. And so Capablanca went to essentially a secondary school in Cuba called Instituto de Matanzas. And there's a picture of that on the bottom left. From there, he went to a school in New Jersey called Woody Cliff School, and there are no surviving images of that school. It hasn't existed for many a year. And then from there, he went to Columbia University. Reportedly in 1910, he went there to study engineering. He also went there because he wanted to play baseball. He was quite a good shortstop. He did not last very long at Columbia, mainly because he was more interested in chess than he was in his studies, and he dropped out reportedly after the first semester. And, Columbia University is in Manhattan, and so he was well placed to go to the Brooklyn Chess Club, the Manhattan Chess Club, and get many a game experience there, where he met, among other people, Frank Marshall. And in 1909, he played a match with Frank Marshall, who was, without a doubt, the strongest player in the United States. And Capablanca won that match, 8 wins, 1 loss, 14 draws. He crushed him. Now, this sent waves through the United States and through the rest of the world. Here is this kid who's 19 years old at the time, who's beaten the top player in the United States and done it and one of the best players in the world. You'll remember that Marshall had quite a bit of international success in the early 20th century. He had beaten Lasker in tournament play and finished first, I think, in Carlsbad 1905 or 1906. So he was one of the strongest players in the world at the time, and Capablanca kind of dismantled him. Now, before we move along, let's take a moment and talk about our first game. This is from Capablanca against Marshall, not in their 1909 match, but instead in 1918. But it'll give you an idea what kind of games Capablanca liked to play and how skilled actually he was. And as always, for this first game, I'll turn it over to Warren Harper.
Now, a couple cool things about this game. So, first is Capablanca's play, and second is this game is pretty much the inception of the Marshall attack. So it's really interesting historically. I mean, the opening today is still relevant. We've seen, Carlsen play it in tournament chess this year, so the opening has survived quite well. Although interestingly enough, nowadays it's really more of a solid opening because basically it's just principled. Black just gets so much great open play and development for just one pawn. So let's check out the opening here. Unfortunately, Marshall was just beginning to develop this, so he did not really find the most testing continuation at first.
Sorry.
Sure.
Otherwise, that chat gets really weird. Okay, thanks.
So it starts off as a Ruy Lopez. Apparently, Capablanca was already suspicious when Marshall played this because previously Marshall at one point had enough of losing to Capablanca's Ruy, so he started trying to avoid it. So Capa was kind of suspicious when Marshall was confidently playing into the Ruy Lopez. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he suspected something. So all this is pretty standard. And castles. I imagine this Capablanca may have already seen it coming at this point because D6 is more common idea. It's not too late to play it, but it's just more typical. So now C3 and D5. So here we commence the Marshall attack, right? So of course, when Capablanca was encountered with this, he figured, taking the pawn has got to be okay. It's a principled reply. Takes and takes, and here is almost a critical path already. So nowadays we know C6 is the most testing move for Black, but Marshall had in mind this Knight F6 move. I guess the reason he did not want to play C6 was twofold. He wanted to use a knight in the attack on the king by maybe bringing it to G4, and second, he wanted to maybe leave this diagonal open for the bishop. So for these two reasons, I guess he preferred Knight F6. But it turns out that C6 is a better idea, simply to keep that knight in the center. Sometimes the threat of it going to F4 can be really useful. So this is all we know now. But Knight F6 is by no means trivial to defend against, and in the first time Capablanca sees this over the board, he manages to find the right defense. So it's pretty amazing. So Rook E1, just simple. So he figured he'd have to play this eventually because Black's going to play Bishop D6, so he might as well retreat it right away. So Bishop D6, right? Now H3. So as we mentioned, Black wants to bring this knight over here, so this move is meant to discourage that and get rid of that weakness on H2. Of course, Marshall plays it anyway. Now the point here is that taking the knight is incredibly risky. Except for Queen H4, it's not exactly easy to tell how White can defend here. So of course Capablanca is not going to take that as bait. Queen F3. Still another nice move. So White protects F2 point with the queen, which Black was threatening after Queen H4, and he also gives Black something to think about, this hanging rook on A8. So it's a very, very nice move. Defensive and makes a counterattack at the same time. So Queen H4. The point here is that the rook is defended indirectly because of the pressure on F2. Right? Now, taking the knight is still a bad idea because of Bishop H2, and then bishop g4, and white's in serious trouble. I mean, for example, queen e4, just bishop f4, and this is a very, very tricky position for white. Yeah, I don't really think white can defend this because of all these black threats, right? So he doesn't take the knight, but d4. So now he controls e5 and gives his bishop an open line. So knight takes pawn. Kind of a surprising move, but the idea is that if queen takes f2, then bishop h2 and bishop g3, and next move maybe bishop h3, and it's going to be an interesting attack. It's not at all easy to play white's position here. But instead of taking, Capablanca just kept a really cool head here. Well, what do you think would be a good move for white here? By the way, black is also threatening directly just knight takes h3. So that's a threat you have to deal with. Bishop f7? I think if bishop f7, black can black just take that? Rook e8. Yeah, I'm thinking black can just take this. Well, if you take on a8, then for example knight h3, and the rook is hanging. You know, if you play a rook e8, then I think bishop f8 is quite fine. You know, if you take the rook, black has this. Yeah, I don't think white's going to get away here. I mean, you can't take because of... I guess black has this cute reply with the idea of king f1, bishop h3. Oh, queen f2, king h1. Yeah, I think. Well. Yeah, I mean, bishop h3 does look good. Yeah, I think queen f2 is probably simpler, just with the idea of rook f2. Right, I'm sure black is winning here. Maybe I'm not so sure. I don't know.
G5. G5. No.
Takes. Yeah, I mean, perhaps just bishop takes h3.
I don't know how you're defending this mate there.
Yeah, now the threats queen f1, rook f2, queen g1, queen g4, and all these pieces are kind of useless. So it's not clear to me how white can stop it now. So yeah, no, this looks like a win too. So yeah, I don't think that taking on f7 quite works. I mean, in a sense, it's not really logical because you don't have any pieces developed, so getting rid of one of your few that's developed is, I think, kind of risky. So how do you think white can try to solve his problems here? So we don't want to take the knight, and black is threatening knight takes h3.
You play something like rook e3.
Rook e3 does stop that, but it blocks a bishop on c1.
Try bishop e3, at least it gets that bishop up.
What's that? Rook f1. Interesting. Take on h3? Maybe, although... Yeah. Well, I was considering knight g4, but I think after the bishop f4, it's not clear what's going on there. Yeah, I imagine knight takes h3 might be. I imagine this is probably what white didn't really want to happen.
Bishop f4 now.
Well, bishop f4.
Yeah, but remember.
Yeah, I mean, in that position, although white has two pieces, black has these three passed pawns. The king is very safe. Yeah, I don't think that's a position white wants to be in. Yeah, I think White's king is just a little bit too exposed here. And then these pieces on the queen side is really hurting. So you want to move your rook somewhere where it's not going to be attacked by, a bishop arriving on h3, I guess, or a knight discovery. Now Capablanca, he just played rook e2. So now on the knight sack on h3, after bishop h3, then White has a tempo to deal with since the rook is not hanging to that Lasker bishop. That's a neat little detail. And by putting it on e2 instead of e3, he still gives that bishop a line of development. So it's really just kind of elegant, I think. It's like the only move that doesn't really hinder his pieces and doesn't put the rook in danger of getting taken. It's really nice. Yeah, and the fact that it could guard h2 is handy as well. Yeah. So bishop g4. So h takes, right? It's pretty much forced. Bishop h2. And bishop g3. So now it looks a little bit scary. Black's threatening checkmate in 1. Okay. By the way, apparently Capablanca was not afraid of bishop g3 here, but of knight h1. He was a little bit afraid, but he was planning on playing bishop b3, and it turns out White's just winning here too. Black has no meaningful discovery in this position, unfortunately. Okay, so bishop g3, just rook takes knight, and the check is not actually a problem. So taking the rook, it might seem like taking the bishop is very strong for Black, but unfortunately, after this sequence, White has king c2, and this black queen, while not trapped, is just out of play. Yeah. So this is not a good position for Black. It's kind of unusual to see a queen hemmed in by a king like that, but it's kind of interesting to see. Yeah, so instead, just took the rook, but now, unfortunately, White's king is plenty safe, and he has a material advantage. And now White's king is very happy to be surrounded by his, albeit undeveloped, pieces. Pinning the bishop. I think it's really nice how he finishes off here. So first b4, just gets another square for his king. a4, since the knight can't be moved, he's got to develop the rook somewhere else. So he's going to open up that a file. And Black tries in desperation to open up the position on the queen side, but it doesn't help. White's king is safely surrounded by his own pieces. This is a good example too of a king being safe despite lack of pawn cover. When you have pieces, that's plenty enough. And he finishes nicely here. White to play and win.
Check on f7.
Queen f7. Queen f7 probably works as well. He just took with the bishop. But yeah, Queen f7 followed by d8 queen looks.
Yeah. And the rook is pinned. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would win too. Yeah. But he decided to take this way instead. I mean, it's crushing in any event because in this position, if you play a king h8, then this is just checkmate. If you play king h7, then queen f5, followed by the same deal. Of course, if you take, then just queen, right? Then just check, right? It's absolutely nasty, right? Kind of a fun checkmate.
Turning to be the second queen.
But I really like this game because of how well Capablanca handled the pressure from the first time he played this. I mean, those first few moves in the opening, going back to that moment after knight f6. He played just those few really accurate moves, and that really made the difference.
So do we still see this opening in this type of, this type of attack they have, the knight f3, or,
The knight f3?
I'm sorry, knight f6.
Oh, yeah, knight f6 has been, pretty much completely displaced by c6. Yeah, this Capablanca game is basically the model game. Essentially, he played basically perfect. Maybe there are a couple places where he had alternatives, which Kasparov points out, but they're really hardly any better than what he did. So, it's really amazing that he was able to play so perfectly the first time he saw this. This h3 move was really crucial. And queen f3, defending f2, attacking the rook, and then the rook e2 move. He's so elegant. It was really nice. Any questions on this game? All right, back to you, Luke.
So after his win over Marshall started advocating that international tournaments invite Capablanca to participate. Now, the Europeans were very reluctant to admit Capablanca into their ranks. They respected Marshall as a player. They were not really sure what to make of Capablanca's success in match play over Marshall. But with Marshall's urging, Capablanca was allowed to participate in the San Sebastian tournament in 1911. Now, you may recall this from our Nimzovich lecture, which was quite a while ago, but the San Sebastian tournament in 1911 gathered all of the best players in the world, with the exception of Emanuel Lasker, and they competed, and you can see Capablanca seated kind of in the middle, looking to the side instead of looking directly at the camera. And you can see some pretty famous names, Tarrasch and Nimzovich and Spielman and Rubinstein, Janowski, Marshall. You can see he was in good company there, and to the surprise of almost everyone there, Capablanca won that tournament. In the bottom right, you can see him pictured as kind of the victor's dinner, looking very somber, and all the other assembled masters with their amazing mustaches lined up behind them. And so Capablanca won this event, and that really made a mark not only in European circles, but it also brought him to prominence in his home country of Cuba. And in 1913, Capablanca was named to the Cuban Foreign Office as a quote-unquote ambassador at large. Now, no one was very clear on what that meant, but in practice what it meant was the Cuban government made him part of consular staff so that he could go play chess and bring glory to Cuba in all sorts of different countries. And so he was initially posted to Petrograd, currently St. Petersburg, where in 1913 he played Alekhine and won their match 2-0. We saw this picture in the Alekhine lecture also, with him dressed in his very formal law student attire. But Capablanca was quite the success in among the consular staff, because wherever he went, his name kind of opened doors. And the reason it did is because there were quite many fans of chess among the nobility of various European countries, and so they're always very glad to receive him. I mentioned the King of Belgium called him Maestro, and the story goes that when Capablanca went to visit Belgium, King Leopold, in violation of his own protocol, got up from his throne, rushed across the room, and said to him, Maestro, I'm a big fan, essentially paraphrasing here, he didn't say it quite that way, and he said, I've studied your games, and what an honor it is to have you here. This is a quote-unquote lowly diplomat from Cuba, being treated very much like an esteemed member of, the ambassadorial staff of his foreign country because of his playing prowess. And this got him favorable treatment on, luxury liners. It got him treatment, first-class cabins on various trains, and his name, as I mentioned, opened a lot of doors. Incidentally, does anybody know, in 1911, I said he traveled to the tournament at San Sebastian. He traveled there aboard a certain ship that sailed from New York to England, and this ship's name would come up a little later on. Does anybody know the name of that ship? Not the Titanic. The Titanic sank in its maiden voyage. Luckily, Capablanca was not on the maiden voyage of the Titanic.
Was it the Lusitania?
It was the Lusitania. He was aboard the Lusitania in 1911, and we can thank our lucky stars that he was not aboard it later on when it was sunk off the coast of Ireland. Again, these historical connections it's just lovely to look at them. So after his win at San Sebastian in 1911, Capablanca figured himself to be a suitable challenger to Emanuel Lasker, who was then the current world champion and had been the world champion at this point for going on 12, 15 years. So November 4th, 1911, he issues a formal challenge to Lasker through a letter. And the text of that letter, as well as Emanuel Lasker's reply, is reproduced in full in Winter's excellent book, which I use in the works cited. And unfortunately, Lasker chose to, A, impose conditions that Capablanca really couldn't accept, and I'll get into those, and B, Lasker used his position as a publisher and as an editor to publish his replies publicly instead of working it out privately with Capablanca, and this created quite a bit of pressure on the negotiations. So the demands, most of the demands we'd recognize. The challenger had to come up with the purse, had to deposit with a certain person a forfeit, which basically guaranteed the match, and if the match did not occur, that forfeit, I think it was $500, would go to Lasker. In addition, Lasker imposed some pretty nasty clauses. First, that the games would be the property of Lasker. Now, this had not been the way it usually is. The way it usually is the games are the property of both players, and Lasker was asking for exclusive rights to publish them and monetize them, and that kind of violated Lasker's own agreements with previous challengers where both players had dual rights. So that was not very well viewed. Secondly, and this was perhaps the worst, Lasker wanted a match with a maximum of 30 games where the winner would win at least 6 of those games. And in the case that no one won 6 of those games, then the winner would be whoever had won the most games, so they didn't count draws, unless there was only a 1-point difference between the players. So, for example, if Capablanca won the match 2-1, for example, Lasker would be declared the winner and would retain his title. If it were 3-2 in favor of Capablanca, same thing. 4-3, same thing. 5-4, same thing. Only if Capablanca either won 6 games outright or won by a 2-game margin would he be acknowledged the champion. And Capablanca, as we might understand, did not take kindly to these demands, and he followed Lasker's lead and made his own criticisms quite public. And he was, as you see in the quotes on the slide, which was written by Capablanca in various articles, they were essentially counterattacking against Lasker. And so this 1911 exchange back and forth didn't really go anywhere. There was quite a bit of animosity and bad blood brewing between the young Capablanca, who at this point is, let's say, 23, and Lasker, who I think is in this point is in his 40s and has been champion, since the late 19th century. It's creating quite a bit of bad blood. Now, they did have the opportunity to work it out in 1914 when Capablanca participated in a tournament at St. Petersburg. And this was, again, a very prestigious tournament. I talked about this with Alekhine. Alekhine is in the back row. He's the third from the left, and again, his formal law uniform. And you can see some of the other famous experts there. You can see Blackburn, Tarrasch was there, Marshall was there, Nimzovich, and Lasker also participated. So these were the best players in the world participating at the time. Lasker essentially is to the left of the chessboard as we look at it. And Capablanca is seated not on the far right, but just inside the right side there, second from the right. And they worked out their differences then. This also was the tournament where Tsar Nicholas the Fourth, I believe, proclaimed the first 5 grandmasters of chess, and Alekhine, Lasker, and Capablanca were 3 of them. Can anyone name the other 2? The original 5, so supposedly grandmasters of chess.
Was Marshall one?
Marshall was one of them. The other was German. Was known for his arguments with Nimzovich. It was Sigbert Tarrasch. So those 5 players, because of their top 5, they were the top 5 finishers in this tournament, were designated grandmasters. And this supposedly, this has been argued by various chess historians, notably Edward Winter, was the first instance of the formal designation of the grandmaster title. Now, so Capablanca and Lasker meet at this tournament. They talk about it. They hash out all the details. This tournament ended May 22nd, 1914. A little over a month later, on June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. And exactly a month after that, on July 28th, 1914, World War I was declared. This obviously put a halt to their planned match. The United States, incidentally, didn't enter that war until April 6, 1917, prompted by the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Germany had initially said that they weren't going to use submarines to target civilian vessels, and then in 1917 they rescinded that and started targeting civilian vessels again, so that was one factor. And then, of course, the Zimmermann telegram, which Germany said, hey, Mexico, attack the United States, take back Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, and we'll help you fund your war effort. And the British intercepted this, sent it over to the United States, and the United States was quite shocked and voted to enter World War I, which ended a little over a year after that. So chess globally is very disrupted by World War I. So what does Capablanca do during this time? Well, he plays in New York. He plays in various tournaments that are held in New York. That first game we saw against Marshall was played during World War I. And so he was basically limited to playing people in the Western Hemisphere because and people who are already kind of on site, because you couldn't really travel safely from the United States to Europe and vice versa because of submarine activity or U-boat activity. So he was challenged by Marshall again in a match, and he defeated him handily. I think this was 1916. He was also challenged by Borislav Kostic. In 1919, they played the match in Havana, and it was supposedly going to be like the first to 6 wins. Well, you remember that Capablanca and Marshall drew quite a bit in their match. It was like plus, 9 minus 1 equals 14 or something. Well, in Kostic, he won the first game. Capablanca won the second game. Capablanca won the third game. Capablanca won the fourth game. And in the fifth game, after move 15, when Capablanca is white, plays bishop b1, Kostic resigns not only the game, but the entire match. Just says, you know what, I know I put up $2,500 to play this match and travel all the way to Havana to do it, but I throw in the towel. And incidentally, Capablanca considers that in 1919 he was playing at his peak. It's interesting to note that, because Capablanca would stay active in chess for at least 20 more years, but he considers the best chess he ever played to be during this match against Kostic. And, I'm not necessarily inclined to agree, because I thought he played well afterward, and we'll see a couple of his games from afterward. Okay, so World War I is over. Germany loses, incidentally, the home country of Emanuel Lasker, and they restart negotiations. So in January 23rd, 1920, Capablanca and Lasker agree to the terms of a match, and Capablanca has raised enough money to secure the match. And they work out a contract with all sorts of different provisions, but little known fact, January 1920, that's when the match is agreed upon. And the match was actually played in March and April of 1921. But in the interim, on June 27th, 1920, Emanuel Lasker resigns his title. He says, basically I retire, and I pass my title of world champion to Capablanca. Now, this was his right to do, because in his match agreement with Capablanca, it was agreed that if, for any reason, Lasker were to forfeit his title, that it would go to Capablanca, And so he was within his right to do that, but Capablanca was not content with that. He wanted to win the title fair and square. So he traveled to Europe specifically to meet Lasker. And in August 9th, 1920, they agreed to another match with a $25,000 purse, which is something like this is somewhere in the lines of almost $300,000 in today's dollars. They agreed to that match to take place in Havana from March and April 1921. The match is the only one. It's the only one in the history of World Championship matches where the challenger wins without losing a single game. Now, I guess in Carlsen's defense against Anand, his first defense against Anand, right, he won without losing a game.
Right.
So it has been repeated, but it was never the case that, and who knows if we should call Capablanca the challenger or the champion, because I guess on paper he was the champion, but he certainly saw himself as the challenger. He won this match without dropping a single game, and it was supposed to be the first to 6 wins, but after game 14, Lasker resigns the match. And we see that Capablanca had 2 wins as white, 2 wins as black, didn't lose a single game, drew all of his other games. Dominant performance. So at this point, Capablanca is the undisputed champion of the world. So before we look at what happens as to Capablanca as champion, let's look at one of those games from Havana, 1921. This happens to be game 10, which if you're paying attention to the cross table or to any of these lectures that we've done in the past, spoiler alert, Capablanca wins. I do want to point out that Lasker had glowing praise, despite their animosity. They both had glowing praise for one another that continued all the way until after Lasker's death in the late 30s. But Lasker believed that Capablanca was truly a chess genius, and he said that to, incidentally, Gregor Piatigorsky. You may remember the name Piatigorsky we talked about in the Fisher lecture, because he and his wife, Jacqueline, I believe her name was, they sponsored the Piatigorsky Cup, which so they were patrons of chess for many years after this. But Lasker confided to Gregor, who was a cellist, I believe, that he felt that that Lasker, or that Capablanca, was the only chess genius he'd ever met. So let's take a look at this game and see where that praise stems from. So again, I'll turn that over to Warren.
Yeah, this game is just a beautiful model of playing against an isolated queen pawn. And we'll also talk about how Lasker mishandled as well. All right. So we were talking about openings before the lecture today, and discussing Capablanca's belief that chess was gonna get really played out and stale at some point. But it was also pointed out that it seemed like every single game was a Queen's Gambit decline. And incidentally, that's what we have here. There's nothing at all wrong with the Queen's Gambit declined at all. It's perfectly solid. It's classy. You see it in pretty much every World Championship match. But that being said, you're not going to find a whole lot of new territory in that opening. You might find something really deep in the opening, but it's if you're looking for opening novelties, you should probably look elsewhere. So none of this was at all new to each other. They'd all played these kind of positions many times. Nowadays, instead of knight d7, it seems like I see a lot more of the Tartakower or the Lasker, before or after the inclusion of h6. So, knight d7 is kind of an old style move, I'd say. Nothing wrong with it, but just different than what I typically see more now. So c5, just a counterattack in the center. Really classical play. And of course, now we reach the IQP, isolated queen pawn position that I talked about earlier. So of course, what Black's trying to do here is control this d5 square. That's really why Black played queen a5, not just to pin the knight. Okay. The queen controls d5, the knight, this knight, and the pawn. So Black has a lot of control over that. But White also has the rook on the d file, supporting a possible advance. Got the bishop and the knight bearing down on that square. So when you're playing an isolated queen pawn position, controlling the d5 square is critical. If black can just simply blockade that pawn permanently, then black will simply be able to slowly pile up on that d pawn, and it's going to put white in a difficult position. So if you're playing with an isolated queen pawn, you want to give yourself the possibility of advancing that to open up the game at the right moment. So if you just are playing with an isolated queen pawn and you allow your opponent to anchor a piece on d5, that's not a good sign. So you need to try to prevent that, and we'll see how white could have prevented that. So knight e5, this is fine. Bishop b5 tries to, with tempo, kind of save that bishop. Because if white could capture on d7, that would draw this knight away from the center. So black doesn't want that. Rook e1, and knight d5. And here we're in a critical moment already, because like I've talked about, black, just with that last move, anchored a piece on d5. So if you allow black to play moves like rook f d8, it's just going to be a torturous position for white. And we'll see what happens with that. So in this position, it's critical. What do you guys think white should do? This was essentially the turning point right here.
Play like bishop takes f6.
Exactly. So we talked about the importance of controlling d5. So it's logical to just get rid of a piece that defends d5, right? So most modern masters now would just take f6 in a heartbeat. Okay. The problem for black is that if you play bishop f6, then white can take and play queen f5, and this is not a fun position to play for black. White just has a long-term initiative here. But of course, the problem with taking with a knight is a tactical one. So if knight takes f6, white has a pretty cool shot here. See if you can find it.
Knight takes f7?
Knight f7 is interesting, but after rook takes f7, it's a little bit unclear.
Or knight g6?
Exactly, knight g6 is a very pretty move. Point here is if you take the knight, then rook e6, threatening a discovered check, and rook e7. And black is unable to defend against that threat. But it doesn't end there. If rook e8, defending the bishop, white has yet another pretty move. Just taking the bishop on e7 is not what white's playing for.
But rook takes e6.
Exactly.
Oh,
You can just take the pawn.
C2, so.
The problem for black is if you take that rook, your king doesn't have a lot of squares it can go to. For example, if you can't take the knight because of discovery, you can't take the rook because of what happened. But otherwise, white's just going to win a lot of material. So, for example, if you take the rook, and now, say bishop takes c8, black's just toast. White's threatening knight e7, black can't take back. Yeah, this is not a fun position. So this would have been a much more interesting game had white taken at f6. Tables would have been kind of turned. But instead, white played bishop takes d5. Of course, this is painful for me for two reasons. First, you get rid of the bishop, yeah. So that's sin number one. Sin number two is you get rid of a piece that controls d5. Yeah, exactly. If you're going to get rid of a bishop, it better be for a good reason.
I was thinking just threat against c3. Is that, that he's threatening with that on that, right?
Yeah, it's hard to know what he was thinking. Honestly, during the game, I imagine he probably thought he was already worse. Simply because in the resulting position, it's kind of sad. White doesn't really have many prospects. So, basically at that time, people hadn't really explored much how to handle these isolated queen pawn positions. So, basically they just hadn't figured out the methods yet. So it's hard to say exactly what he was thinking, but yeah. So now white has a problem. The bishop's under attack and knight c3, so he has to trade that bishop off. But of course, black is left with that iron grip on d5. And what happens is this interesting transformation in the pawn structure. Now, you might think that now that black has another isolated pawn himself, that this is really not much of an advantage for black. And white can play more actively than he did, by the way, and I'll mention that. But structurally speaking, black is just doing much better here. What do you guys think the reason for that is?
2 pawns on d5, right? That pawn.
Yeah, black owns d5,
You're
but
taking the knight too.
what's that?
The c3 knight is blocked by the c6 pawn. There are 2 squares it can't go to because of that.
That's true. So although black has really strong control over d5, white has control over e5, maybe c5 too. So white has his squares too. But just looking in terms of the pawn structure, why do you guys think this is good for black? It may not be that obvious, but it's not complicated. So the issue that white has is that his pawn can be easily attacked by c6 and e6. But black's pawn on c6, it's unclear how white can really attack that easily. And b4, b5, maybe. So basically it comes down to, if black manages to pin down white's rooks on the d file, then black can attack the pawn further with like c5 and e5. So in the event of doubling pieces on the d file versus c file, white's going to be screwed because of an eventual pawn advance with e5 and c5. Black can attack it not only with pieces but pawns. So that means that any defense where white just triples pieces on the d file to protect d4 can never work, because black can just pile on more attackers. So that pawn moving from b7 to c6 is actually pretty useful for black. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's one reason why Lasker ended up deciding to close the d file. But Lasker did have his chances. So yeah, knight e2 is just far too passive. I mean, this is you're eventually going to lose. You're just going to suffer a lot. What he should have tried was knight a4, trying to activate this knight on c5. So this was his best choice here. It's still a difficult position because d4 is weaker than c6, but it would have been a better try. At least his pieces are all centralized. But yeah, knight e2 was just way too passive. Black just has a great position. Yeah, rook d5 is very nice. Just prepares rook d8, just triple pieces on the d file. So white decided to try to close the d file off. The upside of this is d4 becomes less of a weakness because it's harder for heavy pieces to attack it, right? But the downside is that you fix black's pawn structure, and the Isolani on d4 can still be attacked. So it's really nice to see how Capablanca wins this. It might not be obvious that black's advantage is decisive, but I think most GMs would feel pretty depressed in this kind of position. So knight f5, b3, and h5. This move is really nice, just positionally speaking. It's kind of an idea, I guess, that you'll see a lot in the French defense or the Carol Khan. So, what do you guys think is the reason for h5?
Protect the knight.
Protect the knight? From what?
From a g4 pawn thing.
Exactly, yeah. So we talked about how great the knight is on f5. So it's not like g4 is going to be a crushingly great idea for white because it weakens his king too. But the knight on f5 is such a great spot. That's such a great spot for that knight that you just want to keep it stable. So that means just keeping it from being attacked. And you see this idea in the French and Carol Khan a lot. I mean, basically, when you have a knight on f5 attacking d4, you want to keep it there, just play h5. It's just a common kind of thematic idea. You'll see it in all kinds of different positions. And here, white, I mean, h3 is a pretty nasty move. Instead, I think a better shot would have been g3, just to keep the option of later playing h3 and only then later g4, kicking that knight away. But h3 is just pretty much a death sentence. You can probably figure out why from my comments. What do you think Capablanca played here?
Then I go h5.
h5?
I'm sorry, h4.
Yeah, exactly. This is another common pawn structure theme. That one pawn on h4 just inhibits white's kingside from advancing now. Now moving g4 is just terribly weakening because you're going to lose that pawn on f2, and that just adds a lot of protection to your king. Exactly, and h4 controls g3, so white's knight can't challenge either. So I mean, after h4, you know, black's position is just absolutely crushing. So let's see how Capablanca finishes it off. Patience is definitely a virtue in these kind of positions. You don't need to rush. Like g6 is just a useful move. You know, having a square on g7 for your king is just handy. You know, because maybe if your knight moves and white gets a rook on the back rank, you'd be checkmated, right? So no reason to rush. Just give your king some extra room to breathe. And do you know what Capablanca is doing with this a5 advance? Is he just marking time, or does he have a specific...
Trying to create another weakness, isn't he?
Exactly. He's making a second weakness on b3. Because right now, a2 and b3 are just fine. So this is a perfect example of a minority attack, basically. So white has managed to exchange queens now, which is nice. But, unfortunately, the rooks is enough to give black a decisive advantage here. So finally we see white play g4 to get space for his king, but unfortunately now, you know, he's opened up that 7th rank. And this makes it really hard for white to defend, having black's rook being able to control all that space. So the knight travels to c6 so that I can attack this pawn from a5. On f5 it couldn't do that. Yeah, it is interesting that Capablanca says here that king e2 is not a blunder. Like, he clarifies for his opponent. He's like, king e2 is not a blunder. He had no choice. He was going to lose the pawn anyway. I thought it was kind of interesting. I thought I kind of came off as trying to be humble, but really saying, you know, he couldn't do anything. I was going to beat him anyway. You know, kind of interesting. Yeah. So of course rook takes b3. So the idea that taking d4 will win it back after. Of course, you don't want to trade rooks in this position after black. With 2-pawn advantage, it's enough, but you know, other than that, you don't want to trade rooks. So now the knight finds even better pastures on e4. Although it doesn't attack the d-pawn anymore, it's now harassing the white king. And white's just incredibly passive here. Of course, Capablanca wins easily. You can just slowly advance your pawn majority here. Now he's created a passer, and at this point Lasker just gave up. You know, he just can't stop the advance of that d-pawn. But anyway, this game is just really instructive. I mean, Capablanca makes it look effortless, of course. I mean, I would definitely suggest looking at some of his annotations of this game, and it's available on chessgames.com, and also just playing over the moves slowly, trying to get a feel for how he played. One thing you have to understand about Capablanca, if you read his notations, you'll see, like, he just makes a lot of general comments. He'll say, oh, to, you know, hinder the rook, or to control the square, or something. You know, it's a stark difference, you know, when you look at, like, Kasparov's annotations or Alekhine, because they always give variations. It's like, oh, I didn't play this because of da-da-da-da-da, and I played this because da-da-da-da-da. But Capablanca is like, oh, I played this because it controls the center. And I think that's healthy to see that, because a lot of times in the computer age, it's really easy to get too mixed up in just calculating things and just variations. So it is really healthy to look at his annotations and see how he thinks. Like, and you really can't just play chess in general categories. You know, principled moves are usually going to be good. You know, in the opening, if you're developing pieces, controlling the center, getting your king to safety, you probably really don't need to calculate. It's probably going to be fine. So you really get that impression from looking at Capablanca. I mean, he was called a natural for a reason. You know, he didn't have to calculate long variations to play good chess. So it's definitely worth looking at some of his annotations. Any questions about this game? Thank you, Lucas.
So after winning the World Championship, I don't want to say that Capablanca was inactive. He wasn't, but his activity level did decrease somewhat, and we'll get into some of the reasons why. Now, when he came back, he kind of, as many various champions have over the years, he did a bit of a tour and a bit of a victory lap. Notably, he participated in various simul's. And it's interesting to note that Capablanca played, as most chess masters did at the time, or grandmasters did, he played a lot of simul's. You'll recall Nimzovich was financially devastated by World War I, and his way to address that was to teach a lot and to play in simul's. And he essentially derived his income from those activities. Capablanca did apparently teach for a short stint in the 19-teens, not after his world championship, but he did participate in simul's and did, of course, get appearance fees, and that was a significant portion of his income. Beyond, we may think the world championship prize would set you up for a year or two. That's not really the case. It was a fairly modest sum, particularly after Lasker received, I think, 60% of the prize pool, because that's just the way it was. The champion got 20% and then the loser got 40%. So essentially, Lasker received the majority of that prize pool. So Capablanca did participate in many different simul's. Most notably, in 1922, and specifically February 4th, 1922, he participated in a simul in Cleveland, Ohio, with 103 boards. Capablanca's score in that simul was 102 wins and 1 draw. I can't imagine the state of mind, but Capablanca goes to great pains to talk about the fact that, he could go to these simul's and, defeat his last opponent, and less than an hour later, he's sleeping soundly in his bed. He goes out of his way to talk about, the fact that he is a calm, reflective introvert, and this is in contrast to people like Nimzovich, who just brooded with nervous energy, or Alekhine, same thing, or more modern examples, Kasparov, who was just brimming with that nervous energy. Capablanca paints a very different picture of his personality. We'll get into a little more of his personality later on, but I wanted to give you a taste for what kind of activities he's doing. He played in a couple tournaments in New York, but not very many after that. In fact, he spent a lot of time working on organization. Now, as early as 1914 and 1915, Capablanca was calling for a type of American chess federation which would, among other things, help organize world championship matches. A lot of the work that was done to organize his match against Lasker was done by Capablanca. He had a couple of people acting on his behalf, notably Fred Shipley from Pennsylvania, but a lot of it was him taking a boat 3 weeks, going over to talk to Lasker, coming back, 2 to 3 weeks on a boat. And this was all very time consuming. And there was, during this point, the advent of the telegram, so there was at least the ability to communicate across the Atlantic. And so what Capablanca really wanted is a way of organizing tournaments on a grander scale. And one of the ways he saw to do that was to create a set of rules governing challenges and world championship matches. And so at a tournament in London in 1922, Capablanca proposed the rules, which would later be known as the London Rules, and it was signed by all of the prominent grandmasters of the day. You see the signature page includes Rubinstein, Maroczy, Reddy, Alekhine, Bogolyubov, Tartakower, and Vidmar. So it includes all of these very prestigious grandmasters who agree that if they challenge for the championship, that it will be conducted according to these London rules. There's something like 21, 22 clauses, like 5 pages long. A, and B, if they were to win the championship, they would use the London rules to govern future challenges. So this is a very, very important step. You remember that the negotiations between Capablanca and Lasker were very prickly, to say the least. And Capablanca wanted to avoid that by stating very clearly, and to get all the major masters of the day, the potential challengers of the day, to agree how they were going to govern that. After this, Capablanca basically entered what I would call semi-retirement. In 1924, he said the following. It was produced in the newspaper called The Bulletin. It says, "I wish to announce that it is extremely doubtful if ever again I participate in an international tournament. Only the fact that it was the first big tournament in the United States for the last 20 years may become to play." This is referring to a tournament that's about to start in New York City. "As for the last year, since my father's death, I had decided to practically retire from hard chess competition. I expect in the future to play only occasionally in public exhibitions. As for my title of world's champion, I would gladly relinquish it, but, feeling that the younger players have a right to fight for it, I shall patiently wait a few years at least until one of them comes up to expectations and beats me in a match for the title. If by chance it should happen that I manage to retain my title for some time yet, I shall then see what steps can be taken for me to retire without giving the other players any just cause of complaint." So, at the time, Capablanca's 35, 36 years old. He's not, he thinks his prime was 1919, 5 years previous, and is come and gone, but I don't believe that that was accurate, and instead he's talking about a semi-retirement. And it makes you really wonder why. Now, one of the reasons Capablanca gave, the death of his father. His father died in June of 1923. Another reason is Capablanca was married for the first time. He married Gloria Simone Betancourt in 1922. They had a son, Jose Capablanca Jr., born in 1923. His father dies later that year in 1923. Capablanca makes his announcement in 1924. His daughter is born in 1925, and his mother dies in 1926. It is a very, very busy, turbulent time for Capablanca, for personal reasons. And so I think this goes part of the way to explaining why Capablanca had fallen out of, I don't want to say fallen out of love with chess, maybe that's going too far, but lost his interest to play chess. I should also note that his first marriage with Miss Betancourt was extremely turbulent in many ways. For one, there were rampant affairs on both sides. Capablanca himself was infamous for being quite the ladies' man, and as part of the diplomatic corps, he met lots and lots of women, and as a chess champion, he met even more women, and he had relations with many, many women, and his wife supposedly also had quite a few affairs on her side, and so this created quite a turbulent relationship, and they agreed to separate. And that was a pretty difficult separation where she moved to Havana with the children, and Capablanca stayed in New York, and they stayed married for 7, 8, 10 more years before they finally decided to divorce, and we'll get into the reasons why a little later. But this was a very difficult time for him on a personal level. On a professional level, he had very little left to prove, right? He's champion of the world, and he's defeated his last couple of challengers handily. There was a period from, I think, 1914 or 15 to maybe 1923, where he didn't lose a single game. He was unbeaten. Now, granted, not a lot of chess is going on during this time, and his competition is somewhat limited by World War I, but he defeats Kostic, he defeats Lasker without losing a single game. He didn't lose a single game until a New York tournament where Reddy actually took a game off of him, and that broke his 8-year unbeaten streak. His match record and tournament record are just outstanding, and it doesn't look like there's probably going to be some strong competition who are going to percolate up, but they're not quite there yet. So he doesn't have much to prove there. In addition, he is busy with some side projects. He wrote some books. 1920, this is before the match with Lasker. He writes My Chess Career. That's a modern cover, obviously. 1921, he writes Chess Fundamentals, which is considered by many people to be one of the best chess books ever written, notably Mikhail Botvinnik, and I trust his opinion on this. And then in 1935, is much later, obviously, a primer of chess. And so he's busy compiling some books, and obviously that's going to bring us some income. He's writing for various newspapers and chess publications. He is doing simuls and getting appearance fees from there. So this is also vying for his time. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, Capablanca is somewhat of the opinion that chess is dead. Now, let me tell you in his words why he thinks that. He's talking about, so he says, no player to date has managed to go undefeated for an indeterminate period of time. I succeeded in going 8 years through 4 tournaments and 2 matches without losing a single game, but finally Reddy at the New York tournament of 1924 succeeded in scoring over me. And he goes on to say, he's talking about draws. He says, it may be that we have not yet reached the point of being able to make draws at will, but if we have not arrived, we are not far away. In reality, I must ingenuously confess that under the proper conditions of training and health, as, for example, at the end of the Moscow tournament, it was impossible for me to understand how I could be beaten in a game as long as I was confining myself to scoring a draw. I am not saying this out of vanity, since, in chess at least, I have never been vain. Not sure I agree with that. I say it out of conviction, admitting, of course, the possibility that I may be wrong. But let us accept that we have not yet reached that point. That is to say that there is absolutely nobody today who is capable of making a draw at will. Even so, we find that technique is advanced in such a way that today there are players of the second category amongst the masters who, by dint of their encyclopedic knowledge, make themselves virtually invincible. He's talking notably about Alekhine and Bogolyubov, and he goes on to say, 3/4 of this process has occurred only in the past 20 years. What will happen within 50 years? So Capablanca is convinced that chess is a dying game. Now, this has been said and resaid many a time, and it's not the last time a world champion would ever talk about being just bored with chess. Fischer comes to mind, for example. And so what Capablanca does is he says, we should change chess. He proposes a 10x10 or a 10x8 playing board. Incidentally, at left, Capablanca is playing a game called Camelot against Sidney Lenz on the right. Sidney Lenz is an expert at bridge. Capablanca apparently was also quite good at bridge and billiards and tennis and pretty much whatever else he set his mind to. But he was convinced that the best way to keep chess viable for at least a couple more centuries, according to him, was to change the board to 10x10 or 10x8, to add 2 pawns to each side, and to add 2 pieces. Now, those 2 pieces are a little bit weird because what they do is they combine the moves of other pieces. So let me read it to you as he writes it. I have suggested increasing the field of operations. By making it larger, combinations would be greater and thus more difficult and interesting. The artistic side would have more scope without the fundamental strategic principles being changed at all. To make only the changes that are necessary, I have suggested that instead of 64 squares, there should be 100. It's 10x10. Later, he thinks 10x8 is better. 2 more major pieces. To complete the range of moves, one of the pieces would have the combined moves of the bishop and knight, and the other those of the rook and knight. One would be placed on the queen's side, the other on the king's side. Instead of having the option of moving 1 or 2 steps, pawns would be able to move 1, 2, or 3. The remaining rules would stay the same. Now, later he went to a 10x8 format, and he kept pawns to 2 moves, as they are in traditional chess. But he did keep those 2 special pieces, the magister, and there's another name for the other one. And apparently he and Lasker played many a game using these rules and had some pretty interesting results. Apparently, it usually led to much quicker games. Usually by move 30, the game was decided, unlike traditional chess, which could go to move 60 or 70, as it often did. And it was decided, as opposed to being a draw, it was usually a win for one side or the other. Also of interest, the bishop and knight could be used, that piece that combined the moves of bishop and knight could actually be used to checkmate, because it combined both movements. Anyway, so he proposed that there would be 2 games. One, his Capablanca chess, which would be for the masters, and the other, normal chess, which would just be for, regular people like most of us. So he firmly believed that his game should be developed and should take the place of chess at the level of master. And so we still know this game today. It's called Capablanca chess, or it's often called Gothic chess. Incidentally, the House of Staunton there, I stole that picture from their website, or I appropriated it. I didn't steal it. I'm giving them free publicity. But they sell a Gothic chess board in pieces that you can actually buy and play. Has anybody played it?
No.
Okay. And incidentally, Capablanca didn't do this, but somebody else came along with this brilliant idea. There is Capablanca random chess, or Gothic random chess. So that exists. So a couple reasons. Family reasons, nothing left to prove, perhaps, and boredom and belief that chess was dying. He certainly got a lot of challenges. He was challenged first by Rubinstein. You have the date there, and Capablanca gave him quite a bit of time to come up with the money for that match. Rubinstein was unable to. So next, he considered Alekhine's challenge, which had come in right after Rubinstein's, but he wanted to give Rubinstein first priority because Rubinstein had asked first. Let's keep that in mind for later. And Alekhine couldn't raise the money either. So then Marshall challenged him. Nothing came of that challenge. Nimzovich challenged him, but again, nothing came of that. Now, they had to, under the London rules, the challenger had to secure $10,000 in funding for the match to happen. That was about $130,000 at present. So that's a fairly significant sum, and $500 of that, or $500 had to be deposited, and if the match couldn't occur for whatever reason, the champion got that $500. So that was a pretty difficult task to raise the money to secure a match. So Alekhine finally succeeds in raising the money, and in September 26th, 1926, he challenges Alekhine, has the money deposited, and he names the venue, as is the challenger's right, to Buenos Aires in Argentina. So after, 6 years without any World Championship matches, and Lasker, incidentally, had gone almost 10 years without being challenged for his World Championship. So in the past, at this point, we've gone 16 years with one World Championship match. Now, granted, World War I's a large factor there, but we've gone a long time with very few World Championship matches. We get a World Championship match in 1927 between Capablanca and Alekhine. So it takes place in Argentina. And to the surprise of many, many people, perhaps Capablanca included, Alekhine wins convincingly. Now, part of the reason this was so surprising is because, for one, Capablanca had a pretty good record against Alekhine in 1913, which obviously had been a long time previous. He'd beat him 2-0 without much cause for concern. But Capablanca had a very, very, very good match record. Let me go over that with you. Overall, Capablanca's match record was 42 wins, 11 losses, 66 draws. 3 of those losses were to Juan Corzo when Capablanca was 13 years old. We can forgive him that. From 1901 to 1926, Capablanca lost 2 matches in match play. Or 2 games, in match play. During that time, he won something like 20 games. This includes the 5-0 win over Caustic. It includes the 4-0 win over Lasker. And all of a sudden, Alekhine comes along and wins 6 games against Capablanca. Now, Capablanca lost 11 games total in his match career. 6 of them were to Alekhine in this one match. That's significant. So, quite surprising. And Alekhine, as you can see from the score, Capablanca had a lead, I suppose, from games, 8, 9, and 10. He had a lead, but Alekhine equalized and then took the lead and didn't really look back. He won convincingly. So Capablanca obviously admitted defeat, and he praised Alekhine's play. He said, quote, "The World Championship is in good hands." And he talked about a return match with Alekhine to take place in 1929. And Alekhine and Capablanca and Alekhine will later hate each other's guts, and we'll find out why. But at this point, they're still getting along quite well. And Capablanca says, "Yes, I'd be glad to rematch with you under the same terms that you extended to me, and that we both signed the London Rules of 1922. I will honor those same terms with you as soon as you issue me a formal challenge with financial backing. We will then follow the rules that you wrote, which I signed to the letter, and, I'd be glad to play a return match against you." As we'll find out, that doesn't happen. But in the meantime, let's look at one of those games from the match. This was game 29, in fact. And we should note that Alekhine was one of those people that Capablanca was referring to when he said that some people had an encyclopedic knowledge of the game, and contrasting with Capablanca, who didn't really practice, who was actually kind of lazy. Alekhine came in, and I think Capablanca was quite surprised by his preparation. So anyway, for that, again, for the final game for tonight, I'll turn that back over to Warren.
So Kappa was a master of the grinds. When he got these kind of positions where you could just kind of patiently maneuver, I mean, he was pretty tough to resist against. So we'll see even Alekhine, who's a very sharp player, had a hard time posing him any issues. So let's check out this game. All right, so again, talking about opening diversity. Guess what opening we have? Queen's Gambit decline. It was all the rage in those days, I guess. So of course, we have this famous kind of little trap here. So white cannot win this pawn on d5 by just taking. Why is this?
Loses a piece.
That's right. Exactly. Black can just take. The idea is that if you take the queen, bishop b4 check wins the queen right back. And here, for example, black can just take bishop, and he'll be up a piece. So yeah, this is a famous little Queen's Gambit decline trap. You'll see this in all kinds of different positions, but it's especially common here. So now e3. So now, taking on d5 is a legitimate threat. So c6. And with queen a5, we have what's known as the Cambridge Springs, and even now it's topical. I mean, back the first time around in the candidates when Carlsen was playing it, he beat Gelfand in a really nice game. I think it was 2013 or something like that. It was a very nice game too. So it's still a relevant opening today. Okay. Knight d2. Now, one of the ideas of this opening for black is, this is one possible line anyway, to win the two bishops. So the problem for white is that this bishop is hanging, and black just took on c4. Now, if you just move this bishop, like say bishop h4, black can just defend the pawn that he just took. And in this particular position, white hardly has compensation. So white is forced to give up the two bishops, regrettably, of course. But in return, black does have a slightly passive position. And it has to do with this light squared bishop, which is hard to develop, and it just doesn't have much space in the center. So this g3 move, I don't know if it was the first time it's been played, but it was the first time that Capablanca had played it. Earlier in the match, I think he played just bishop b2. Of course, the idea with g3 is to put the bishop on the long diagonal where it'll be more effective, maybe. Because on e2, the bishop doesn't really have a target. I mean, you put it on e2, and you just kind of attack empty space. So this time, white directs the bishop towards this queen side, which you'll see later on it's actually kind of useful. Theoretically, I don't know if it's better than bishop e2, but it does pose black some different kind of problems. So b4, this move is just designed to stop c5, of course. So because that b4 pawn hampers that, Alekhine's trying to give Capablanca a weakness on b4. Now, one thing to note here, b4 is not just a hanging pawn. What do you think Capablanca would have played if bishop takes? With knight b5, you attack the queen and you expose a new attacker to that c6 pawn. So after the black queen moves, you can just take c6, and black will be left with the same, bad pawn structure situation that we'll see later. And you'll see why it's bad having that pawn on d6. So instead, rook c8 to overprotect c8. And knight takes. Queen takes was slightly inaccurate from Alekhine. Probably slightly better taking with a knight. But regardless, white has a small plus here. Queen takes, knight a4. Defending that b6 pawn is kind of annoying. You can't defend it with the rook because you drop c6, and defending with the queen can be tricky too. Queen d8. And of course, b5 saves the pawn, but white also creates this weak pawn on b6. I mean, this is just basically the dream scenario of a minority attack. We saw earlier in his game with Lasker, where he just changed the pawn structure from 2 versus 1 to 0 versus 1. And this gets rid of your weakness and gives back that weakling on b6. Now, by the way, an easy way to judge the health of pawn structure in general is just count pawn islands. Now, pawn islands is just a group of pawns together, and you want fewer of them if possible. And so in this position, white just has one giant pawn island. It's very pretty, very compact, easy to defend, and black has 2. And this little difference is pretty relevant, because for black, it's unclear how you can even improve your position. There's no weakness to attack. Open files don't do you much good, whereas white just has an easy target on b6. Here it turns out that you can't defend b6 anyway, though.
What happened if black did c5 instead?
Okay, so instead playing c5 to try to defend or keep white from exchanging 1 for 2.
Mm-hmm.
Here white would take on c5, and then after play rook d1, and you're going to win that e6 pawn, basically. Yeah, so unfortunately black was kind of in trouble no matter what. But yeah, you're right. You really, black, I'm sure Alekhine was pretty sad to see that, because he knew he was going to suffer. So, yeah, unfortunately for tactical reasons, you can't really prevent it.
And that's the definition of minority attack. Either one or less than one, whatever you have the minority on, to either reduce a weakness.
Yes. Exactly. It's when you use when your opponent has a pawn majority on the side of the board, but you advance yours and leave them with 1 or maybe 2 pawns that are just by themselves, and you have open files to attack, and they just don't have anything to attack you with. So that's kind of the idea. So one of the main ideas is to open up files, and here white has A, B, and C files open, and black doesn't have really means to protect b6. Unpinning the knight on a4 is what rook c1 was doing. And now white finally wins that pawn. So this is just going to be a very difficult defense for black, but it's interesting to see how Capablanca plays. Alekhine defends really well too. A general point, queen e4, it looks natural from my perspective, but the point of this move is just to keep the queen centralized. Queens work well in the center of the board. There's really no reason beyond that. Knight g5 is kind of annoying, so bishop f6. King g7 because white was intending maybe d5. And now white will finally be able to make some kind of passer. So white was able to trade rooks, getting rid of possible counterplay. So now he can advance this pawn. Now queen c3 actually was an excellent decision. By the skin of his teeth, Alekhine can draw his position. But, he was already tired from defending the whole game, so I'm sure that's why he didn't find it. I think if he was fresh, had plenty of vodka in his system, I think he would have found it. And here Capablanca finds a nice move, so this looks like a very hard position to win. White has to be precise. There's only one move white can make here to try to win this.
About 94.
Exactly.
Threatening forward.
So now the problem for black is he can't bring the king closer to the pawn because of that fork. And when the knight arrives there, it'll stop the black king in combination with the pawn from getting to any of these squares. So with the knight and pawn, it's very pretty. It locks the king out from there.
And the white king can seek out the white diagonal and support his pawn.
Yeah. So this is the only move to really offer resistance because if the black king gets to d6, it's not going to be a position that white can win. So this was very nice. So the king was saying go to e4, of course. But now white can push the king back with g4.
After there, Capablanca considers this next move by Alekhine to be a mistake.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to point that out. Okay. So here, I mean, there are a couple moves. I mean, Alekhine points out bishop d6 is a draw, as well as bishop b6. Both these moves, the point is you don't want to get your king too far from the d-pawn. And king g5 was headed in the wrong direction. Essentially, it's a losing move. So yeah, that was definitely a mistake to play king g5.
Capablanca wrote that he feels that this was what changed a draw into a win.
Yeah. I mean, well, like I said earlier, I think Alekhine would have found it if he was more fresh, but he'd been defending the whole game, so I think it was just basically exhaustion.
Well, this was actually after an adjournment.
The next day?
Yeah, this is a continuation after an adjournment.
He had he sealed king g5?
No, that was. Let's see. The adjournment happened before the queen trade.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I imagine he was still tired anyway, though.
Yeah.
There were quite a few number of moves. But yeah, I mean, after king g5, what do you think Capablanca played? Very pretty move here.
95?
Well, d6, black can take it. And yeah, 95 is what he did. Black has a problem here because if you try to treat their king, then you'll get forked on d7. So now the king is temporarily locked out. And meanwhile, white's threatening to take on f7 and to play d6. So black has a big problem. And for example, if you play f6, then just knight f7, followed by d6, and white wins. So black unfortunately locked himself out. Yeah, he played bishop d4, but this was difficult. Yeah, f5 is no better. I think Alekhine points out just d6 wins. And if you take just king g2, and white will play d7, knight c6, and combination and win that bishop. So yeah, unfortunately, it's really no way to defend this position. Apparently, the computer suggests the best defense is like bishop a3 or something stupid, but it still loses. Bishop d4. Of course, with the second pawn now, it becomes a win for white. King e5, white can trade, and then he has a winning pawn in game. So unfortunately, black can't approach the pawn. So now we're in the same position basically, except black has no f-pawn. So this is not possible to defend anymore. Of course, you can't take the knight because again, white has a winning pawn in the right takes, and then white locks the black king out. Yeah, you can't take the pawn because of g7, of course. And now d7.
Oh.
Nice tactical finesse. Can't take again because just g7. Two passers are too much for black to keep up with. But yeah, just a really nice game. I mean, but interestingly enough, if you look at the whole game, there's really only one decisive mistake. It was just king g5. So all it really took was just one mistake. But that's the problem when you're getting grinded down in these kind of positions, because your opponent can play pretty much whatever they want, and you're treading a thin line. If you mess up, then it's just over. That's difficulty when playing this type of position with Capablanca. Any questions about this? All right, back to you, Lucas.
So Capablanca was writing for newspaper about the progress of the match. And he said, with this result, the match takes on fresh interest. He was referring to the fact that he closed the gap to, I believe, 4-3, but unfortunately, we know that Alekhine went on to win fairly readily by a final score of 6 wins, 3 losses, and lots of draws. Now, I mentioned that Capablanca wanted a rematch, and he talked to Alekhine at the tournament. Alekhine said, of course, I'll offer you the same terms that you offered me, what we both signed. And Capablanca took a little bit of time to actually issue a formal challenge, and he was preempted. In August of 1928, Bogolyubov issued a formal challenge to Alekhine, and Capablanca issued a challenge a little over a month later, and what Alekhine said to Capablanca is he said, well, I received Bogolyubov's formal challenge first, and just as you did with Rubinstein, I want to give him some time to try to raise money for the match. So he gave him far less time. He gave him, I think, 3 months. In the meantime, Capablanca was preparing in case Bogolyubov couldn't raise the money, and then he'd step in. Bogolyubov raised the money, I think, on January 10th, 1929, and his deadline was January 15th. So it's close, but he raised the money, and so the World Championship match proceeded in October and November of 1929. And what Capablanca did is he said, well, I'm not going to get preempted again, dang it. So he drafted a formal challenge to Alekhine to be delivered, and he was sure that Alekhine was going to beat Bogolyubov, as were most people. And he did very easily. And so the day after the tournament or the match ended, Capablanca had delivered to Alekhine through the French post office his formal challenge for an upcoming match. And so that was written by Capablanca October 1st, 1929, and it was actually delivered to Alekhine November 26th, I think, 1929, and Alekhine accepted it. However, there was a problem. Between the time that Alekhine drafted the letter and the time that that Capablanca drafted the letter and the time that Alekhine received the letter, something kind of big happened. The stock market crashed. Now, Capablanca was based out of New York, and a lot of his friends were New Yorkers, and they had made quite a bit of money through the stock market. If you look at a graph at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, it kind of goes up in almost an exponential fashion, and it kind of drops in an exponential fashion after Black Tuesday in October 1929, and then again on the Friday following. The stock market lost a huge amount of its value in a very short period of time, and of course, there was a big run on the banks, and the Great Depression followed shortly thereafter. So between the time Capablanca drafted the letter and the time Alekhine received and accepted the challenge, Capablanca developed a big problem, and that was his funding essentially disappeared overnight. All the people that were ready to back him had to say, we're sorry, but we just lost 50% of our net worth, or however much it was, and that they couldn't fund him. Now, so Capablanca tries to buy time with Alekhine. He proposes initially that they play in the winter of 1930 to 1931, but then a short time after that, he writes him again and says, well, no, that was a clerical error. I meant to say the winter of 1931 to the winter of 1932. And Alekhine pointed out that the challenge had to be issued and the funding had to be, the deposit had to be paid within a year of the match commencement, and that by proposing these later dates, Capablanca wasn't fulfilling the terms of the London rules which he had himself crafted. This was it marked a bit of a deterioration between their relationships, because Alekhine was putting off accepting other challenges to give Capablanca time, and Capablanca was kind of delaying and then finally fell through. And B, because Capablanca in the interim had proposed changing the London rules by directly communicating with FIDE, the nascent FIDE president, and the press, without talking it over to any of the other signatories, of the original London rules, such as the current world champion, Alexander Alekhine. He proposed, for example, that matches be limited to 16 games, that they be played, the first to 6 or 16 games, and then you take the score. And he proposed that they change the time control. Instead of doing sessions of 4 hours, they should change it to sessions of 6 hours or vice versa. And so he was proposing these changes, but he wasn't the champion. And he was proposing them for a cycle that he wasn't necessarily a part of because he was not under contract to play. This was poorly viewed by Alekhine. But the real blow happened on February 20th, 1931. Capablanca issued a bit of an ultimatum. It wasn't really his place to do so, at least in my humble opinion. But he issued a bit of an ultimatum to Alekhine via correspondence, which was published in the American Chess Bulletin. And it says, "Dear Sir, the enclosed was released yesterday in the press. I now await your answer before taking any further steps. Whereas you won this championship, and whereas you agreed to play a return match, and whereas we all are party of the London rules, whereas, it says, I now," again, this is February 20th, 1931, "I now hereby issue a final call upon you to accept my challenge for the playing of a match for the chess championship of the world to be played under the London rules of 1922, either in the United States or Cuba during the winter of 1931-1932. And now declare that, in the event of your failure to accept this challenge to appear against me, I will be compelled to claim the championship of the world by default, and will be prepared thereafter to meet all comers for the title in free and open competition." Well, needless to say, Alekhine found this insulting. But Alekhine did something a little surprising. He said, "I accept. Let's start a match between August 15th and September 15th, 1931, 6 months from now. Get the money together. Let's play. Put the deposit on file with your backer, with a financier that we mutually agree upon. Let's talk about the venue, and let's make it happen." This was March 16th, 1931, less than a month after Capablanca issues his ultimatum. May 15th, 1931, Capablanca withdraws his challenge. And this began a period not just of animosity, but outright hatred between the two players, because Alekhine saw this as a betrayal, both of him as a world champion and his, what he thought were reasonable demands, notably the London rules they'd all agreed upon, to arrange for a return match, and Capablanca had failed to meet the conditions that he himself had penned 10 years previously, again and again and again. Okay. So this begins a period of true hatred. In fact, at this point, they stopped really seeing each other and crossing paths in tournaments. There was a famous instance of a tournament in Pasadena in 1932, and they wanted to invite Alekhine and Capablanca, and Alekhine said, "Well, if you're inviting Capablanca, you're going to have to pay me an appearance fee of $2,500. They didn't invite Capablanca. And Alekhine participated for free, which was strange because normally world champion demanded at least an appearance fee then, as they do now. So this was perhaps the low point in Capablanca's career. He plays in 1927, played a couple of tournaments after that, but not really anything from... he played one tournament in 1931, and then he played nothing until 1934. And for all intents and purposes, it looked like Capablanca's career was over. And then perhaps a little bit of a renaissance. In 1934, he meets a woman named Olga Chagudyev, and she's given the title of princess. She was an immigrant from Russia, and I'm not entirely sure what her claim to the princess title is, but she was designated a princess by title, and they met at a party in New York at the house of a mutual acquaintance, and Capablanca fell in love with her pretty much immediately. He said to her that first night, "Someday you and I will be married." And they started a courtship and later moved in together, and they wanted to marry. But first, Capablanca had to get divorced from his wife, who was living in Havana, and that was a very contentious thing. It took several years to work out, but they finally divorced, and then they were able to get married in 1938. And I will say, for posterity's sake, that a lot of what we know about Capablanca's temperament and his personality was, and a lot of what we know and keep in the public eye is because of her advocacy and her representation of Capablanca well after he died, all the way into the 1980s. She would give presentations at the Manhattan Chess Club, and she donated a lot of memorabilia to that same club, and they still have it all in their possession, including letters and all sorts of other things. She kept a couple of things for herself, but she donated quite a bit to them, and we can find a lot of those documents there to this day. So they married, and Capablanca started participating in tournaments again. He said, I will. He basically said, I want to win the crown for you. I want to, get back into the shape I was in. Unfortunately, Capablanca is getting a little older, and he's starting to have problems with high blood pressure, but he does very well in various tournaments. His first tournament was Hastings 1934. He came in fourth. But, for someone who was pretty much out of practice, it was a fairly decent result. Margate 1935 is climbing up the rankings, second only to Reshevsky. The field perhaps wasn't quite as strong. Moscow 1936, he wins against some very good competition, including Emanuel Lasker, who's still around and still playing, and according to Capablanca, still really good. And a young Mikhail Botvinnik, you see, who's entering the scene there. And perhaps his biggest tournament win was Nottingham 1936. Now, those of you who are passionate about chess history will know that this was one of the strongest fields ever in a chess tournament, and it was one of the most famous chess tournaments of all time. We could talk about Zurich 1953 perhaps, but this would probably be in anybody's top five as a extremely notable tournament for the competition. You have everyone there, including Alexander Alekhine, playing in the same tournament as Capablanca for the first time since their World Championship match. You have up-and-coming players like Salo Flor. You have, obviously, Mikhail Botvinnik, who tied for first with Capablanca. Capablanca won on tiebreaks. And you have Uwa, who was at the time the reigning world champion. So you have a who's who of chess greats really at the time. And it's a very strong field, and Capablanca ties for first with Botvinnik, and they do it they both do it in an impressive fashion. I should point out that Botvinnik and Capablanca's story goes back quite a bit further than this tournament. They first met, you may recall, in 1925. Capablanca was doing a simul in Moscow, and one of his opponents was Botvinnik. And one of his losses, in fact his only loss of that night, was to Botvinnik, who was 14 years old at the time. They thought very highly of each other, as you might gather from Botvinnik's praise for Capablanca's book. Anyway, this was a real highlight of kind of the second half of Capablanca's career. Unfortunately, that success would not continue. First, Capablanca had lobbied FIDE, who was a very young organization at this time, to take over arrangement of the World Championship cycle. Now, again, he had tried to get the American Chess Federation, the predecessor of the U.S. Chess Federation, to help organize a World Chess Championship as early as 1915. And in 1937, at FIDE's annual Congress, Capablanca lobbies intensively for them to nominate a challenger for future championships. Now, he wanted this because when Alekhine lost the title to Uwa in 1935, their contract stipulated that Alekhine would have the right to a return match. So Capablanca was locked out of challenging for a couple of years until that return match happened. And FIDE voted before the return match that whoever won the championship, if Uwa retained or if Alekhine won, they voted that the challenger would be Flor, not Botvinnik. In fact, not Capablanca. Capablanca was defeated by a vote of 8-5 in favor of Flor. So FIDE, in their first scandal of many, they voted that Flor would be the challenger, not Capablanca. Ouch, that hurts. Well, Alekhine and Uwa both stated that they were not going to hold themselves hostage, if you will, to FIDE's deliberation. And Alekhine said that if he wins, he would have a rematch against Capablanca. Interesting, considering the level of animosity between them. So Alekhine does win, and he offered a rematch to Capablanca. with the funding coming from Argentina/Uruguay for a match to take place in the fall of 1939. So Alekhine offers all of this. Capablanca doesn't have to go out and arrange funding. It's already arranged. Doesn't have to name a time. Already arranged. Doesn't have to name a venue. Already arranged. All Capablanca has to do is sign on the proverbial dotted line. And he does. What they're going to do is they're going to go compete in the team championships in Buenos Aires in 1939, and then afterward they're going to play their world championship match. Well, that didn't happen because during the world championship, during that team championship, World War I begins. Yes, that team championship started in August of 1939, and as you know, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Germany and Poland, incidentally, had teams competing in that team championship, and Germany ended up winning by half a point. So Capablanca is writing at this time, and it's funny to see what he doesn't write. Here's what he writes, his first article after September 1st. This is September 5th, 1939. He says, "The events in Europe have obliged Critica," the newspaper is running for, "to suspend for a few days the articles which we have been publishing about the international team tournament and everything related to it. As a result, we have not," when he says we, he means I, but he doesn't want to use the first person, "we have not until now been able to speak of the first phase, which has been completed, and the 3 rounds of the final which have so far been played." That's all he says about World War I, other than to say that England withdrew to send their players home. He says, "There's also a very difficult situation for the teams from Germany and Bohemia/Moravia with regard to the Polish and French teams. Many players from countries not involved in the war are also tense, either through feelings of solidarity or simply because of the present circumstances. They are not in the best mood to produce what is expected of them. It may thus be seen that the tournament is suffering the consequences of the present situation, at least internally, and it remains to be seen how these difficulties and any others that arise can be dealt with." World War II has just broken out, and he calls it the events in Europe. Now, granted, at the time, it wasn't known that this was going to become, quote-unquote, World War II. It was just Germany invading Poland. And Germany and France had signed a non-aggression treaty. The author of that treaty, von Ribbentrop, incidentally, had danced with Capablanca's wife in the Cuban embassy in Paris in 1937. So he was well known to Capablanca, and they didn't know that the war was going to spread to include, the entire world at this point, but it made for a pretty tense event, and it also meant that Alekhine, as a reserve member of the French army, his role was translator, you may recall, was mobilized, and he had to respectfully tell Capablanca that he could not play their match after all because he was being mobilized into the army. And he was, and Alekhine died champion, and there wasn't a world championship, chess championship, until after Alekhine died, and FIDE organized it, and Botvinnik won. I think that was 1947. Capablanca was really never the same. He had health problems. He had high blood pressure. In the Avro tournament in Holland in 1938, when he was playing Botvinnik, he may have actually had a mini stroke. His peripheral vision went dark, and he went to the restroom, splashed some cold water on his face, didn't help. His brain was buzzing, and he lost that game, but he didn't say it was to his health. He complimented Botvinnik on a game well played. He had further health problems, and his personal physician told him that he really should stop playing chess because of his blood pressure, and despite Capablanca's insistence that he was a calm guy and could sleep like a baby, his wife, Olga, tells us that he was very temperamental. She said, quote, "When he flew into a rage, it was like a hurricane." And she took conscious steps to not upset him, to keep his nerves stable and to keep his high blood pressure in check. But unfortunately, in 1942, March 8th, 1942, the morning of March 8th, 1942, he died. He had been at the Manhattan Chess Club the previous night at about 10:30. He was talking to some people, and he paused, and he asked if people could help him take off his coat, and then he later collapsed to the ground. There was a doctor on hand. They admitted him to Mount Sinai Hospital, where incidentally Emmanuel Lasker had passed a few years previously. And he had had a cerebral hemorrhage. There was nothing anybody could do, and he passed away the following morning. His remains were transferred to Havana, where he is buried in a cemetery there with a very fitting chess piece on display. And with the travel restrictions being lifted and improving diplomatic relations between the countries, you could travel there and take a look at it, hopefully pretty soon. Now, I want to talk a little bit, and this will be the last thing, I want to talk a little bit about his legacy. Warren's done a very good job of showing you how good he was at the chessboard, and we've heard from Lasker how much of a genius he was. And there's often a discussion, particularly online, about who the greatest player of all time is. And I've seen this discussion time and again on sites that I frequent, like Reddit. I've seen it in YouTube comments. I've seen all sorts of discussion about who is or isn't the greatest of all time. A case could be made for Capablanca. Computer analysis in 2007 showed that, according to Ribka anyway, the engine evaluation, Capablanca was found to be one of the most accurate players of all time. He and Fischer obviously were up there. So I think we could all agree that Capablanca would be in our top 5. But in order to discuss, what Capablanca himself said, I want to read for you in his words what he thought about selecting one person to be named the greatest players of all time. He talks about Morphy. He says, and this brings me to a very delicate subject, the often repeated statement that Morphy was the greatest player that ever lived. To compare old players with the present ones would be, in my opinion, idle speculation. It would largely rest on personal opinion. Yet if we must compare, we can only do so by considering facts and results. If the men who make that often repeated statement would take the trouble to study and analyze these facts and results, they would find that the hero's record would be against him. Yet I would not undertake to say that the players of today are superior to Morphy. There would be no way to prove it any more than others can prove the contrary. All the great players of today have great respect for Morphy's name, but is not founded so much on what he actually did as on the way he did it at a time when chess was yet, comparatively speaking, in its infancy. So he addresses a little bit of the idea there. That was in 1922. And then in 1925, he says something perhaps a little more to the point. Says it is often said that Morphy is the strongest player that has ever been. In our judgment, such assertions are absurd, since not only do they lack any basis, but it is in any case impossible to prove them. All that would be possible to make is comparisons on the basis of his matches and according to the strength of his opponents. If we made such comparisons, the result would be disastrous for the assertion of the admirers of the great master of the past. He says, Morphy was quite good, but we couldn't say that he was the greatest of all time. Although if he played against players of today, there's no telling what would happen. He says, concerning an oft-repeated declaration by a large number of admirers who believe that Morphy would beat all today's players, as we have already said, this has no foundation. If, on the other hand, if Morphy were resurrected and were to play immediately only with the knowledge of his time, he would most certainly be defeated by many present-day masters. Nevertheless, it is logical to suppose that he would soon be at the necessary level to compete against the best, but there is no way of knowing exactly how successful he would be. Capablanca was very cautious he was very, I would say, efficient at diffusing the argument that Morphy was greatest all time, but he was unwilling to place himself in that position, and he cautions us to refrain from trying to do that ourselves. Despite all that, it is interesting to note that in terms of accuracy, Capablanca was certainly one of the greatest, and I definitely agree with people who initially suggested that, or who pointed out that it was a travesty to skip over Capablanca in this series. And so I'm glad we came back and gave him his due. So for the works cited, I really only used 2 works, and they both come from Edward Winter, who is the preeminent chess historian of the 20th century, at least in the English language. First is this book, which I previously mentioned, which contains a ton of primary sources from Capablanca himself. And second, an interesting online article that Winter wrote about his conversations with Capablanca's second wife and her remembrances of him, which gave some interesting insights into their relationship and into Capablanca's overall temperament. Finally, to close, I want to read for you what some of the other masters said about Capablanca. Botvinnik said, "I think Capablanca had the greatest natural talent. When a pianist plays, we don't hear separate notes, but we hear a musical picture. So too, Capablanca didn't make separate moves. He was creating a chess picture. Nobody could compare with him in this." So that was Botvinnik in 1984. Bobby Fischer said in 1961, "Capablanca is possibly the greatest player in the entire history of chess." He also thought Morpheus perhaps deserving of that. My favorite quote, though, actually comes from Spassky. He says, "Personally, I think the best chess player of all time was Capablanca, especially because he was very lazy, and I am lazy too, so I can understand him very easily. But he was a real genius." And it's true that Capablanca did achieve much of what he achieved and did reach the pinnacle of the chess world largely through natural talent as opposed to study. And he is perhaps one of the last world champions to have done so, because we can certainly say of Alekhine, and we can certainly say of Botvinnik, and I'm not entirely sure of Owa, but definitely Botvinnik and the Soviet GMs who would come later, that they studied in addition to playing, in addition to their natural talent. So he is certainly one for the ages. Now, as always, if you guys have any questions about Capablanca, we'll try our best to answer them.
Is children play chess at all? Is there any record?
So that's an interesting question. They may have played casually, but I can tell you with absolute certainty, because Capablanca says it, he did not teach them chess. I don't know that it was his intention for them to follow in his footsteps. In his correspondence with him, some of which is reproduced in Winter's book, he talks about various pursuits that are worthy, but he never really mentions chess in that same breath. He instead talks about, academic studies. He talks about athletic studies. He talks about being a person of strong morals, but he does not talk about chess.
I wonder if it's because it was so natural to him. Maybe he wanted to see it was natural.
Perhaps, but I think that he may have also wanted his children to be their own people, to grow up and do what they wanted to do instead of following in his footsteps. And in many ways, Capablanca may have regretted the fact that he became, particularly by the time he had children, that was, when he was kind of in a funk, he may have regretted the fact that he devoted so much of his life to chess. His second wife talks about the fact that he could have been accomplished in any career that he'd set out to do, law or medicine or anything else. And Capablanca repeatedly talks about the fact that all the other grandmasters have prestigious careers. Lasker was a PhD mathematician, and Tarrasch, I think, was a mathematician, physician. So he's a medical doctor, and Alekhine was an attorney, and Morphy had been an attorney, and this, that, and the other. And Capablanca, okay, he's a diplomat, but it was kind of an honorary position. It wasn't one that he had really earned through distinguishing himself through his studies. And he talks about all these other grandmasters with their doctor title, Dr. Alekhine, Dr. Tartakower, Dr. Tarrasch, and I wonder if perhaps he was a little envious of their distinguished careers in other things other than just chess. So he may have wished for his children to distinguish themselves in a career as opposed to in what he considered something of a pastime or leisure activity. You recall it wasn't until Fischer that it was considered acceptable to do chess as a career. Botvinnik was a PhD electrical engineer, for example. And okay, so next month, not next week, that's scary. We're going to look at some of the kind of unknown chess players of the 20th century. So we're going to look at three. I'm going to give you a little bit of biography, and Warren will give you one game from each, and hopefully there'll be people you don't know too much about, but in order to preserve the surprise, I'm not going to tell you who they are. So you'll have to come back next week for that. Well, obviously you'll probably get the email or see it on the website, and it'll spoil it. But anyway, so that'll be next month, and then we're going to move on to the current candidate cycle by looking at the biographies in chess of all the players who are participating in the upcoming candidate cycle for the World Championship to see who's going to challenge Magnus Carlsen. And we'll have 8 months, and we'll have 8 people to feature. And so that will look at more contemporary players with less of a biography, but certainly more chess to discuss.